You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
What if the real power to fix our broken food system isn't in the hands of billion-dollar agribusiness, but in the callous, soil-stained hands of women farmers you've never heard of? While headlines spin stories of crisis, climate collapse, empty grocery shelves, rising prices, a quieter revolution is taking root in fields, on ranches, and along coastlines around the world. And it's being led by women. I'm your host, Dana DiPrima, and you're listening to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects the food on your plate to the rest of the world. And here is where small shifts in how we eat and farm can reshape the world. Today, we ask, what if the future of food isn't about more technology, more chemicals, or more efficiency, but about more care, more justice, and more local power? To help us answer that, I am joined by Nancy Matsumoto, journalist and author of Reaping What She Sows, How Women Are Rebuilding Our Broken Food System. A bold, beautifully told look at the women transforming agriculture from the ground up. Through real-life stories across continents and commodities, Nancy shows us why small women-led farms aren't just surviving. They are building the blueprint for what comes next. In this episode, you'll hear why women are leading the charge in sustainable regenerative agriculture, how small producers are building resilient local food systems in the face of climate, war, and corporate control, and what you, as an eater, can do to be a part of this transformation, starting right now. If you've ever wondered what difference your choices really make, this conversation just might change the way you shop, eat, and think about food forever. So if you're ready to move from passive consumption to powerful connection, this is the episode for you. Stick around. This is One Bite is Everything.
What I can see is huge climate change issues, huge geopolitical issues on the horizon already happening with all of these global wars disrupting supply chains. And I think those two things, the politics in the US alone, I happen to be an American living in Canada now. So I'm seeing the amount of pain and hardship that's being inflicted by the US tariffs in the agricultural sector. And it's really on both sides. It's not just the Canadians, but both sides are hurting. It makes what I'm writing about all the more important because I'm talking about very small, very resilient local and regional food systems. And so when you see these long chains disrupted through climate change, war, all kinds of external factors, you realize that local and regional resilience is more and more important. Women, I see at the forefront of food system change. It's just what I've seen repeatedly in my reporting. Women, of course, like any other sector of the economy, they make less than men. They tend to be found less in positions of power at the top of the conventional agricultural system. So there's just more innovation going on where they are, on the margins, on the periphery. They're more forward-looking and they're more nurturing and caring. They're thinking about the collective and they're thinking long-term, not just about profits tomorrow. So it's about how do we feed our community over the long term. And so these are just some of the factors that I think make women so important in the future of food and how we're going to feed ourselves.
Can we go back a little bit to the climate and the war and the tariffs and the impact and what you're seeing specifically? I mean, especially across the border between US and Canada, like what, just a little bit more specifics about like the kind of pain that you're seeing that these elements are causing.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like the steel and auto industries. People talk about how intertwined the two economies are. So there's a lot of going back and forth of inputs, of seeds, of products in the agricultural sector, just as there are in the automotive sector. And so it used to be, we have a free trade agreement and it used to be quite open. Now all of that is being called into question. A lot of it is just the uncertainty of not really knowing what shoe is going to drop, and it makes future planning very difficult for any kind of business that's dealing in trade. It makes future allocation of budgets and how we're going to shepherd our resources right now, let alone thinking about the future, very difficult. I think people are very loath to make economic investments, to make big spending. Everything is sort of a closing in and a just wait and see, not necessarily the best way to grow a business or to feel like you can take risks and do things that really are necessary maybe for long-term thinking. So again, it promotes that short-term thinking rather than long-term strategizing, which I think is a hallmark of a resilient food system.
Let's talk about women in particular. You've enumerated some of the barriers that as women we've felt and seen and watched. But in terms of a very distinctive sort of female modus operandi, what do you see as the key tenets of that, especially as it has to do with developing agriculture?
I'm thinking of so many women who I met in the course of writing this book, a number of people who are coming from science backgrounds. There's a woman who has a PhD in fisheries management in Thailand who saw the big picture of how you're in Thailand, small nation surrounded by oceans, but people in Bangkok weren't getting local fish because of the way the global seafood supply chain worked. And so she sort of put aside her academic knowledge and said, I'm going to help forge these short, direct, and transparent networks. And she really was kind of like giving this community tough love in that a lot of times the lack of capital is a real deterrent to growing these small systems. And so she forced them to put aside money every year, even though she did get a grant from the EU, because she said, look, you need to be economically independent, you need to be sustainable. I felt that this was kind of a really maternal instinct, trying to take care of her flock and guide them financially in ways that were going to make them sustainable over the long term. I spoke to women who were head of agricultural co-ops in Guatemala, for example. This is a woman-led short supply chain, which on the retail end is headed by a Guatemalan woman based in Florida who started a small coffee roaster and is sourcing directly from her home country of Guatemala, but also throughout Central America and Latin America. And she went back to the small village, women-led co-op of coffee farmers. And they had traditionally had male leaders head of the cooperative, but it was mostly women. And she really encouraged a woman who she felt was very capable, sort of a natural leader, and pushed her and said, I think you can do this. And again, kind of promoting women to step up, to really develop these leadership skills that maybe they didn't have because of the patriarchal nature of the society. So to see women helping other women develop these leadership capabilities was, I felt, kind of like the way this alternative food system that I advocate for needs to develop. So a lot of natural women leadership and a natural women innovation, but also women helping other women to gain expertise and experience in leadership positions.
Women are rapidly reshaping U.S. agriculture. According to the USDA, they now make up about 36% of all agricultural producers, roughly 1.2 million farmers nationwide. More than half of all farms, 56%, have at least one female decision maker. And though only about 9% of farms are operated solely by women, their influence is transforming the industry from the ground up. Unlike traditional large-scale agribusiness models, many women farmers approach agriculture as both a livelihood and a form of stewardship, seeing themselves as caretakers of land, community, and future generations. Studies show they're more likely to embrace regenerative and organic methods, diversify crops, and participate in conservation programs. This isn't just about environmental values, it's also practical resilience. Ecological farming helps smaller operations thrive amid climate shifts, labor shortages, and volatile markets. By blending ethics of care with innovation and collaboration, women are cultivating a quieter revolution in U.S. agriculture, one rooted in sustainability, balance, and long-term vision rather than extraction and profit. And with regard to those two stories, both in Thailand and from Florida to Guatemala, what was the impact of that sort of intervention that these women were exacting?
I think just a more robust Brazilian local food system where women were doing little microloan businesses and they started their own craft business offshoots. I think just a sort of an expansion and an entrepreneurial impetus that it gives them to go out and start other small businesses. They got a loan from World Central Kitchen, for example, to start a small meat raising. So you could see this kind of spreading out of their network. And a lot of the things that I write about have to do with overlapping knowledge networks as a way to link small and regional food systems. So in the aggregate, when you look at the kind of knowledge exchange that is made possible today through social media and how you can have farmers or fisher people in one country talking to other small fisher folk in another, and also linked through wonderful organizations. Like there's a woman, another academic at Memorial University in St. John's, who has started a global network of small fisher folk. And so aggregating these people from around the world and saying together, we may be small individually when you look at the industrial fishing system, but in the aggregate, we really have a lot of power, and we can say to regulators in countries around the world, you have to pay attention to our needs, and you have to let us coexist with big fish and big industrial fishing supply chains. One of the things that's so interesting, and I tried to highlight in my book, is how these relationships between the commodity food system and the small alternative alt food systems that I describe, how in every sector they're very, very similar. You have extremely large, extremely extractive, increasingly run by global monopolies and a fewer number, whether it's the meat industry, the fisheries, vegetables, poultry, grains, it's all the same. It's the same story. And so one of the objectives of my book is to really lay these two systems out side by side. And so readers, through the amazing stories of these women change makers, can really grasp the big picture from a systems point of view of, oh, I can support this small, regional, and local, which is not so small when you think about how it's connected globally to like-minded producers around the world. Or I can support this very huge, very long, exploitative and extractive global system, which is doing terrible things to our health, to our climate, to our ecosystems. And so really to sort of paint that picture and show how no matter what chapter and what sector you're talking about, the patterns are the same, and the exploitation versus the regeneration is exactly the same.
That sounds like a really big aha to me, that across industries that there are these incredible parallels, because it seems like if that's the case, that there may be some interesting solutions. What kind of solutions did you see, or did your subjects sort of point you in the direction of through your work?
Yeah, well, first, thank you. I hope it is a real aha moment to people, because I think everyone needs that sort of light bulb moment to switch their behaviors and their consuming patterns. I do think that the solutions also tend to have a universality to them, as do the barriers.
Before we go any further, I just want to say, this really hit me, that this isn't just about farming or climate or food. And it doesn't matter what part of the food system we're talking about. It's about whether we build a future rooted in exploitation or one rooted in care. And the women Nancy writes about, they are not waiting for permission. They're doing it now, on their land, with their hands. It made me wonder, what would it take for more of us to follow their lead?
So if we talk about the solutions first, it's building community is a big part of it. Educating is so important because unless people understand what you're trying to do, sometimes they're less inclined to get behind you. One exception to that rule, I just wrote a Substack article about the regional grain networks. And it's very interesting because people who are within it, and I'm talking about the millers and the bakers and the farmers, have different approaches to their theory of change. So, for example, here in Toronto, we have a wonderful, very outspoken whole grain baker named Dawn Woodward, who is really an advocate for re-regionalizing grain sheds, the nutritional benefits of baking and using whole grains. You're not wasting as much, you have way more nutrition. But the big key to turning on her customers is really taste. Her things taste amazing because she's usually using locally grown, locally milled, very fresh whole grains. And there's nothing white. It's all, lovely earth tones, really whole grain stuff, and it's incredible. One of her key quotes is, "It's taste that turns the key for people." It's that most of her customers at the farmers market aren't thinking, oh, I want to re-regionalize the grain system. They're thinking, wow, Dawn makes amazing things. I'm going to go up and line up at her stand at the farmers market every week. And then this wonderful London baker that I just interviewed, she said, well, I'm actually very quiet about it. I want the goods to speak for themselves. And I was there, and she makes amazing everything, viennoiserie, breads, really seasonal pastries. And there's a lineup out the door, of course. And I said to this young man with a stroller and a baby, why do you come here? And are you into the whole grain movement? And I don't know anything about that. I just come because this is amazing. And that was kind of her strategy. And she said, look, if people ask me, like, why is it so much better here than elsewhere? She'll say, it's the way I source, the way I use organic, local, regeneratively grown grains, it's this and that. And she's happy to expand on it, but it's not her main way of doing it. So back to your question, there's different ways. The education piece sometimes is upfront, sometimes it's more the taste piece is first, and that's going to attract people to it. I think the pandemic, when all these long supply chains were broken and container ships were stuck in the ocean and they couldn't get through, people were forced to look in their backyards and see who are the local farmers, and maybe had never even bothered to look locally before. And I think in many cases, people were kind of shocked and pleasantly surprised by how good things were, how fun it was to be in touch with a local farmer, how much they learned. I'm part of a local food co-op here in Toronto, and I just became obsessed with these Ontario grown peanuts because they were so superior to anything I can get at a supermarket. And I ended up writing an article about the farmer for our little co-op newspaper. And I found out how it's much easier to grow with way lower chemical load here than in Georgia, where a lot of our peanuts are being imported from. And all the things that went into having an incredible tasting product. And it's fun, and you can educate your fellow co-op members. This is why we need to support people like this. And it becomes this real community building part of life. And it's become very important to me. And just to get me back on your question about, what are the commonalities of these small alternative food systems and how they're making it work. Corey Carmen, a wonderful grass-fed beef rancher in Eastern Oregon, talked about really having to rethink how she's marketing her product. So she has this cow share, which is an amazing part of her business where you're doing like anything to a half to a quarter of an animal. And that's just very high profit margin for her. But then realizing that people really want to eat less meat if they're thinking about their carbon footprint, and if they're thinking about the carbon footprint of conventional CAFO, confined animal feeding operation beef, very high, very bad for the environment, for our waters, for our soil, for our health, for the animal health, for workers. So in my book, I encourage people, yes, definitely cut way down. And then if you're going to eat beef, go to someone like Corey, who's regenerating rangeland that's not really appropriate for row crops. So it's not like you're taking land out of cultivation. This is land that we need to return to really robust ecosystems of grasslands because of the amazing ecosystem services, and grazing herds of cattle on it only helps that. And so she's as passionate about regenerating the landscape as she is about her herd. But then thinking about, okay, how are you going to sell these products? She's thinking about moms who are really busy, who maybe are thinking about the health of their newborns or their children. So they do want grass fed, but maybe not the big slab of prime rib, but how about smaller packages that can be easily turned into dishes if you're a busy mom on the go? So really thinking about how to market to the people who care about your product. And so I see this kind of marketing, just thinking about how to present your product. Also, I think just sort of building every link in the supply chain takes so much effort and so much work. And that's where a lot of the bottlenecks.
In the U.S. food supply chain, bottlenecks often show up where small and mid-sized producers, many of them women, lack access to infrastructure dominated by large agribusiness. Women in agriculture are increasingly identifying these choke points and developing creative, community-based solutions. One of the biggest bottlenecks lies in processing. For instance, there are far too few small-scale meatpacking plants, leaving regenerative and grass-fed farmers waiting months for slaughter slots. Another occurs in distribution, where local growers struggle to access cold storage or transportation networks controlled by major distributors. Women-led cooperatives and food hubs are emerging to bridge these gaps, like those in Vermont, North Carolina, and California, that pool resources for refrigeration, marketing, and delivery. There's also a bottleneck in market access. Federal procurement systems and grocery supply chains often favor large volume suppliers, prompting women entrepreneurs to create direct-to-consumer models, CSA programs, and farm-to-school networks. In tackling these inefficiencies, women are reimagining the food system from the ground up, making it more resilient, equitable, and rooted in local economies.
And so many of the women who I write about are working on, okay, how do I clear up this choke point in the supply chain, whether it's the mill that doesn't exist or the farmer who, in this area of, say, the Northeast, people haven't grown small grains for decades because the industrialized industry has all moved to the Northwest. So you almost have to give farmers a premium, an incentive to go back to some of these small grains that can also be cover crops. So at every piece of the supply chain, there are challenges, and these are also universal. And you see people working on these supply chain gaps that they have to solve. So it's a very complex picture, but I think these women take a lot of joy in feeding their community and taking care of their land and the animals. It really is a very holistic way of living. And it's just, again, so different from our commodity food system where we're so divorced. And you've talked about how we're not in touch with our food and our food system. And so much of my book is like, yeah, let's get in touch. Let's see how it works and what these women are doing.
So many small farmers are going out of business. We lost 141,000 farms between 2017 and 2022, which obviously the numbers, we're not accounting for what's been going on recently with bankruptcies in Q1 of 2025 in the US through the roof. even in comparison to the pandemic when things were really rough. I feel like we have a little bit of I mean, maybe David isn't the right name because we're talking about the women, but a David and Goliath kind of situation where our bigger farmers or our bigger industrial complex that has a lot of farmers feeding into it and the sort of small, more regenerative farmers. What do we do? How do we stave off the depletion of these small farmers, given that they live close to the margins and they have their own daily struggles? So
I agree, David and Goliath is not quite right. Davida and Goliath. I mean, I use the analogy in my book because
Dana and Goliath.
Dana, there you go. Yeah, no, I use the analogy because it's so true. The two systems are outrageously mismatched. When you think of the amount of even lobbying power that these giant agribusinesses have in the halls of power to affect legislation, when you think about all of the federal funds that they get in the form of crop subsidies and loans and sweetheart deals that are just propping up industrial corn and soy, when this is the last thing that we should be supporting. You also add to that the fact that one of the things the women producers are passionate about, who I write about, is ecosystem services, what they are doing to repair and to roll back 80 years of damage of industrialized agriculture. So big ag and big food were profiting for decades on all of this extractive production that they were doing. They were spewing out these externalities onto the global south, onto huge medical bills in the form of heart disease, diabetes, malnutrition, horrible pollution. So all of these ecosystem services that these women food producers are supplying is basically uncompensated. They're not getting government money to do this. They started to get a tiny bit under the Biden administration in the Affordable Care, this big infrastructure bill, which was actually a climate bill. Little pieces started to fall into place that were being funded. Climate Smart Agriculture Program, those have all been rolled back under the current administration. So this is all just to emphasize how outmatched the two systems are because of these disparities and these inequities. So it's all the more reason to think about public policy as a really important lever for change. One of the most depressing chapters in my book was the small dairy. I spoke to a wonderful small dairy grazing discussion group and was privileged to be allowed into these regular Zoom calls that they had, where they talked about their economic challenges. They talked about the big difficulties of making a profit in the economic climate of organic dairy grazing. And I painted a pretty dire picture. And after the book went to print, a number of my sources said, hey, things have actually gotten better. You have to emphasize that was a snapshot in time, and it was really dire. Organic Valley cooperative farmers were getting less for their milk than it cost them to produce it. It was that bad. And so it was very grim. But what changed it? There was a lot of lobbying on the part of small organic dairy producers, and it at different levels, state, I don't know if it was just state or more, even more local, but at different levels of government, things started to change a little bit. The reimbursement scheme, just how they were operating. And so what I realized is this is an up and down thing always that people continually have to be advocating for and trying to change the regulations and the rules. The title of my book is a nod to a 1947 book called As You Sow, and it was by a social anthropologist who chronicled 3 communities in the Central Valley and how when agribusiness moved in and sucked up all the federal dollars, you had this really very sad depletion of community vitality, health, economic well-being. So this has been going on for decades. It's nothing new. But again, it's sort of this cycle of up and down, boom and bust. Whenever you have a commodity product, it is subject to these boom and bust because supply and demand are left to the market to regulate, and this just doesn't actually work all the time. So I think we have to remember that it's sort of an ongoing struggle, and it takes constant vigilance on the policy and the legislative front. But that as consumers, if we recognize this, we can also really put our support and our consumer dollars behind the system that we believe in. And that's kind of the whole point of my book.
So, what can we do? I mean, obviously, these producers are out there doing their parts. They're looking at the system and trying to build the pieces that they need in order for their products and their communities to thrive. Besides supporting them and shopping with them, what can we do?
Yeah, I tried to make my book as actionable as possible in the, what can we do to make things better and what can we do to move change forward? And so I got suggestions from different women subjects of my book. They range from if you are in a community and say your child is in a school system, a charter school, a private school, whatever, you can go to that school and you can say, hey, where are you sourcing all your produce and your proteins from? Can we make a change in that? Can we do direct local sourcing for at least maybe a percentage of it and then grow from there? And there are stories in my book of areas that have done this, and they become part of that local ecosystem of the alternative food system. If your community has a food policy council, find out what they're doing, join it if possible. If they don't, maybe you can advocate. We need to be thinking about our own communities' food sovereignty, food resilience, and ability to feed ourselves because it's going to become more and more important with climate change and with global instability. So these are things you can do on the sort of procurement and legislative and policy fronts. In Ontario, there's a big threat to farmers because of development encroaching. The city is growing bigger and bigger. And there's a lot of political pressure on these farms, an existential threat to their existence. Who are the politicians who are fighting against that and who are going to try to preserve farmland, which really are our local alt food system suppliers? So again, this is sort of on the policy point of view. One farmer in Minnesota told me the story of how her son went to university and he and his whole dorm floor opted out of the food plan, the meal plan. And they went to the local, not too far away farm and said, look, can we put in a weekly order from you? And his mother, as a small farmer, said, farmers would be so happy to get this bulk order. Sometimes they'll actually deliver it to you. And the dorm floor had a great time cooking together. It was a very bonding experience. They really loved it. So I love that story too. I tell stories about these wonderful, powerful group of women in Hartford, everything from the food policy head changing the bus routes of the local community so that the people in the North Hartford food desert didn't have to take 3 buses and make 2 transfers if they wanted to get nutritious, good food for their family. To the local community advocate in North Hartford, who for 15 years now has been trying to get a full service grocery store in this food desert. So there are a lot of stories about what you can do as an individual, as a member of your community. And then I talk about just how you can try to educate yourself more in an era of rampant greenwashing, where you're seeing a lot of claims on labels, and how do you know if they're true? I know you've talked on the podcast about certifications and how complicated they can be. And so much of it goes to, well, if you really care, you can do your own research. You can see if lawsuits have been filed against certain companies, if people have questioned their claims about transparency and about sourcing. I wouldn't necessarily believe everything I read, especially if it's coming from a big company who really is seeing the economic potential of claiming to be regenerative and having regenerative products. That's the top-down kind of thing that's happening, as opposed to the people that I'm talking about who are grassroots, bottom up, and are much more accessible to you to say, oh, what are your growing practices? What's your farm like? Those are the kinds of things that you have a little bit more assurance that what they're saying is true. So yeah, I just try to put in different actionable advice in the book that people can act on.
Now, obviously, there are small farmers in all of my listeners' local communities, right? And they are men and women, but maybe there are more women doing farming than there used to be. So, is that what we're looking for? Let's find those women farmers and make sure they're supported, or we're just looking at small and local?
Yes, I mean, I wanted this book to be about small women producers, but of course, there are wonderful men who are in this category. And I say in the book that I don't even want to denigrate larger farms. I do think that we need a diversity of farming methods and styles to feed the world. And what I would like to see is the two sides increasingly becoming similar. And you see large-scale farmers adopting cover cropping and reducing inputs because it's saving them money. They're realizing that they are getting more biodiversity. They're realizing that this makes economic sense, not just ecological sense. And so ideally, you would see the two sides coming closer. You would see prices equalizing more because, that price differential can be a barrier to people. And I write about that too. So I'm not at all anti-technology because I think we need all of the advanced farming techniques that we have. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not necessarily anti-pig farm. I'm just saying we need to think about our practices and our values and try to really make them more sustainable and more regenerative over the long period.
I do think the smaller farmers are really a standard bearer, even for really big ag. Like, how do we get these practices? How, if you want to be a regenerative multi mega corporation, how do you do it right?
Yeah, I think one of the really important contributions of that small farm economy is rural vitality and the vitality of small communities across the world, really. And I've been to areas of the Midwest where vast monocultures of corn and soy, there is no sense of community. There is no sense of a center of things. And when you go to one of these alt food systems that are really thriving, and I write about a number of these in New England where everything is connected. The orchard is supplying the local restaurant and the local food banks, and you're seeing their products throughout a local economy. And people in Vermont, for example, told me how the firefighting the forces are all voluntary in some of these small Vermont towns, and they're mostly dairy farmers. So if you start losing all those dairy farmers, you're losing the firefighters, you're losing all of the people in that local economy, from the repair person, the delivery person, the people who pick up the products. It's a whole economic chain.
Large monoculture farms operate on an industrial scale that disconnects them from the very communities surrounding them. Workers are often underpaid or replaced by machines. Local suppliers are cut out, and profits flow to distant corporations instead of circulating through that local economy. The result is hollowed out rural towns with fewer jobs, shuttered main streets, and a fading sense of belonging. In contrast, smaller regenerative farms tend to function as community hubs. They hire locally, collaborate with nearby businesses, and sell directly to neighbors through markets, CSAs, or farm stands. These farms don't just produce food. They cultivate relationships, knowledge sharing, and mutual support. While large monoculture operations extract value from both land and people, regenerative farms reinvest in the social fabric, fostering trust, resilience, and a sense that everyone's well-being is connected.
And it goes back to what Walter Goldschmidt was writing about in 1947. You're hollowing out these rural communities. So yes, it would be great if a larger farming operation took a page from that and said, how can we build community and what can we do to increase local vitality? Because that's not how they're thinking. They're thinking maximizing profits, extracting and taking out what you can and not really putting anything back in to the community, to the environment. There's nothing regenerative about these extractive long chain businesses.
I would love to see some of the women that you feature in your book take over a really big agricultural monocropping operation with no community and terrible soil and just turn it on its head as a really great example of how that could happen, because I believe it could.
And it's happening through these pockets of resilience that are being connected through knowledge networks and sharing. And I just think we have to sort of be able to imagine that kind of interconnected global alternative food system and say, wow, I want to plug into that. I want to help grow it because this is really the way we're going to survive the future.
Well, I hope everybody's listening to that. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about your book? I know it's 9 chapters. Is that right?
Yeah, 9 chapters. I pick a different sector of the food system for almost every chapter except the first chapter. I start because I want to sort of lay out a roadmap for the alternative food system. So I open the book with an examination of Southern African American agricultural cooperatives from the Civil War through the Jim Crow era. And I also tell a few stories about my own family's history of incarceration during World War II as people of Japanese descent living on the West Coast of the United States. And the reason I start with this is because both are disenfranchised communities who have no official federal support, who are basically left to fend for themselves. And the way they do it is through cooperative enterprises and mutual aid societies. And because the comparisons are very obvious between this sort of Dana and Goliath system that we're talking about now, I want to see how can Dana move forward and survive, taking a page from the book of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which at one time presided over 1 million acres of Black-owned farmland in the South. And they were sharing resources by giving loans, technical knowledge, equipment exchange, all of the things that you would hope government is sort of helping out with, but is not. They had to do for themselves. Similarly, for all of the 120,000 people of Japanese descent who were put in prisons, these very big consumer co-ops sprang up in many of the 10 concentration camps that emerged. And I write about one of them at the Manzanar prison camp where my father was incarcerated, and how thriving and how amazing it was. It became the second largest consumer co-op in the US at the time. So these are examples that we, feeling extremely outnumbered and outmoneyed, can look to as, okay, there is a way to do this, and people have done it before. So I start with that chapter, and then I end with a chapter on seed saving, because I really think of it as a hopeful way to think about the future. And I talk about diasporic women who have ended up in North America through war, refugee camps, all kinds of disruption that have driven their people out of their country. And then how do they preserve their taste memories, their connection to culturally appropriate foods through seed saving, also going against this big seed where about 4 companies control over 60% of our seed stock and have locked it up behind intellectual property patents. So again, a big versus small, but I hope more hope-giving ending to the book.
What Nancy shared with us today is more than a collection of stories. It's a roadmap, a reminder that change doesn't always come from the top down. It often starts in quiet places, in a field, a kitchen, a farmer's market stall. It starts with women who dare to imagine a different kind of food system and then build it, one harvest one decision, one bite at a time. If there's one thing to take away from this conversation, it's that you do have a role to play. Whether it's rethinking how you shop, supporting a local farmer, asking better questions about where your food comes from, or simply caring a little bit more. Your choices matter. And this is just the beginning. If this episode sparked something in you, go deeper. Listen to more. Talk about it. Share it. And if you haven't yet, please leave a review. Your feedback helps other listeners find the show and join the movement. One Bite is Everything is co-produced by Sonia Dillon with sound engineering and original music by Russell Chapa. I'm your host, Dana DiPrima, and I will see you next time, where we will keep digging into the stories that grow the future. Until then, eat like it matters, because it does.